Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Public Works Committee will come to order. We have a relatively short agenda tonight. Hopefully we'll not keep you too late this evening. With that, as usual, we have a consent agenda and general agenda. We have 4 items on the consent agenda. Are there any of those that need to be pulled for discussion?
Mr. Chairman, if there are none, I move for approval of the consent agenda.
All right. Made and seconded to approve the consent agenda. And the vote's up on your screen. Yes or nay. And looks like unanimous. That's approved. Let's go back to item G1, please.
Item G1, resolution authorizing permanency of honorary street name signs for Madame Mary L. Flake Haney.
And I believe Mr. Turner or Ms. McCullough will be reporting on this.
I'll take it quickly, Mr. Chairman. This was a request from the council member of the ward for a making of a temporary honorary street name sign to be permanent. Under city policy, the mayor can make a proclamation, pass a proclamation, whatever, to establish a temporary honorary sign. And under that policy, that sign can stay up for up to 1 year, 12 months. And if there's a desire for that sign to be converted to permanent, the city council has to pass a resolution authorizing it. And that's what's being requested in this case.
I believe this is in the Southeast Ward, Mr. Salem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This particular sign has received a good deal of support. It has been there for at least a year. The mayor has supported it. The community supports it, so I supported it this time. So without further ado, I'll put a motion on the floor to move approval of this particular item.
Very good. Is there a second?
A second. You have a question?
All right, just a moment. Yes, there's a motion on the floor, and Mr. Larson has a question.
This is really a congested intersection. Are we designating a street name or an intersection, or what is this sign? This sign's going up at that intersection of Lawtown and Martin Luther, right?
It's up already.
So it's up already,
and
right.
it's an honorary designation. It does not change the official name of
One
the
of the
street.
brown signs.
Correct.
That hangs there. But it only hangs at that location, or is it hanging elsewhere at other intersections on either one of those streets?
Just this location.
That one location. You like that location?
I like that location and the people who support it.
Oh, good. You got it there.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's brilliant. I think we should go forward with it.
So we've got yes, no, or abstain, please. Very good.
Brilliant's not enough.
We have that passed unanimously. Thank you very much. And let's go to item G2, please.
Item G2, Stormwater Fund Overview Presentation.
And I believe Mr. Huff is taking this one. Is that correct?
It'll be a tag team.
All right. Then whomever goes first.
Ms. Saunders will be following.
Very good. You've got slides. It's on your iPad and on the screen. Please go ahead.
All right. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This is a Stormwater Fund overview presentation. What we're going to try to accomplish is just give you a general overview of the status of the fund, a little bit of history, our current residential and non-residential rate structure that we're imposing right now, go over some stressors to the Stormwater Fund that are affecting its status and will affect its future status, and then give you an update on the stormwater spend plan as we have it today, and then observe trends. As you're probably aware, the stormwater rates started in 1997 as a part of the NPDS Phase 1. This is a state and federal activity that mandated medium and large municipalities to implement stormwater management programs to control pollutants. So the city started that in 1997, have been carrying it up through today's date, and average annual revenue for the Stormwater Fund is about $10.2 million. And the rate structure we have currently in place was established in fiscal year 07-08. It took into account 4 residential tiers and 1 non-residential rate for commercial industrial property. And again, those rates or fees have not increased in the past 10 years, so they have aged a bit. Your fees that you're getting now, you can see the breakdown. We get a little bit from plan review, about $2,200, but the lion's share comes from our residential, non-residential building. Residential takes in on average about $4.2 million, and then your non-residential takes in about $6. So you got about a 60-40 split between residential and non-residential. And like I say, the paltry amount from plan review. How that breaks down in square footage is you get about 3 million square feet from commercial, institutional, or non-res as we put it, and then you get about 223 million from residential. So again, that forecasts that approximate 60-40 split. And then what we call an equivalent residential unit, or an average price or average amount of square footage of impervious area in a home, is about 3,400, give or take. So that's your median size home in Winston-Salem, 3,400 square feet on average. So here's your rate structure that's currently in place. We have 4 residential tiers, as I mentioned before. If you have from 1 square foot to 2,000 square feet, you're paying $51 annually. The lion's share, again, is in tier number 2, where you have 2,001 to 4,000 square feet, and they pay $54 a year. Tier 3, your larger properties, residential properties, go up. You can see the scaling factor there. To the largest greater than 6,000, they pay $108 annually. So that's your residential breakdown. Commercial pays $831 per impervious acre annually. So that's a flat fee based on your impervious area, and it's a minimum charge of $55 on the site.
Is that 55 for commercial or residential?
That's your commercial rate. For a minimum commercial property, you have a minimum rate of $55.
Mr. Montgomery had a conclusion?
Yep, and that impervious surface includes the structure and paving if there's driveway.
Yes, sir. Councilmember, that's your driveway, your sidewalk, an outbuilding, anything that the rain can't soak into on the property. So what the money pays for. In this pie chart, you see the broad spectrum of services that are funded by the stormwater utility. You have general fund services like 3RC, vector control, seasonal leaf collection. They are all funded out of the utility. Drainage maintenance, erosion, floodplain, they have customarily been funded out of the utility as well. One thing I want to draw your attention to is the capital projects item. Want to draw attention to this because this particular component has experienced exponential growth in recent years, where we're seeing more and more projects come in. The expense of those projects, the complexity has grown. So this particular item has increased exponentially in recent years. Some stressors to the fund. Decommissioning of impervious surface area. As you're probably aware, House Bill 275 was passed in 2017 that exempted our airport, the runways and taxiways from paying our impervious surface fees. That's a net reduction each year of about $46,000 to the utility. So that's taken a hit, obviously. Whitaker Park, for example, has also decommissioned some impervious surface area. To a lesser extent, they're in the $30,000 range approximately for reductions on their site. But this decommissioning of an impervious area has led to some stagnant revenue streams in recent years, and will so in the future. Other stressors to the fund. As far as projects, we have had several city parks that have been added to the service network. Spring Park, Laughlin Park, Washington Park are all slated for repair efforts. We have more than 30 projects, larger scale projects throughout the city, and a identified cost of over $24 million in growth. And the projection time to complete those projects are over 20 years. So we're continuing to see different projects come up too, different projects that were not anticipated, but due to the age of our infrastructure, sudden failures, we need to address those. What you see here is a list of projects that we have either in process or have identified a scope, fee, and pricing to undertake. I'll just highlight a couple. Old Salem Drainage Project, that's in queue now to be constructed. Lockland Park was recently completed a couple months ago. Spring Park is an emergency fix that we're currently trying to undertake. You've got your customary programs, your 70-30 cost shares on private property. We earmark funding for those every year. Infrastructure improvements, those are your out of left field, so to speak, projects that were not identified, but we need to hold some funding for. Miller Park, currently under construction. 7th Street, that is a collaborative project with the Wake Forest Innovation Corridor. Washington Park is currently under construction. You see smaller projects here. Macon Drive, that is a infrastructure replacement. Northwest Boulevard is a private-public partnership effort there. More projects here. Bennett Commonwealth, we have infrastructure deficiencies there. Marguerite Park Drive, that's a flood-ravaged property. We are working with the property owner to receive grant funding. And then you have pollution remediation projects. These are projects that we actually had to push these out to future years due to their cost. But down at City Yard, we have a very large-scale project there for fly ash, petroleum-contaminated soil, and lead removal there. And then once that pollution has been removed, then phase 2 of that is to do a regional stormwater facility there. So some large-scale projects there. And I won't belabor the time by going through the rest of them. But you can see there's a fairly large queue of projects in the hopper known. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa to talk about the spend plan and their projection.
Good afternoon, Chairman Bessie and members of City Council.
Good afternoon.
So the first slide you'll see is a cash flow projection for the Stormwater Fund. The blue line is if we do nothing, no rate increases based on the current assumptions, and let me sort of go over those quickly. We're looking at the 6-year capital plan through 2024. And let me go to the next slide, and I'll go more specifically over those. But the next is if we have some rate increases, you can see that we will break even by 2024. And I've put just enough rate increases in to break even, not even to maintain our fund balance policy. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but the assumptions that we looked at or considered here are, again, we looked at the period of the 6-year capital plan. We looked at an expenditure growth of 3% of operations, plus the existing debt service that we owe on the revenue bonds to date and any capital equipment outstanding. Keith has already gone over all the capital expenditures, which were about $14 million over this period of time, in addition to the pollution remediation, which is about $10 million over this period of time. And so what I've done is I've gone in and in 19, 20, and 22, I've projected rate increases of 8%, and in 22, 23, and 24, rate increases of 3%, and that was simply just to meet operating expenditures because they're growing at 3%. And so I'll go through the revenues, just a line at a time. Thank you, and that's very hard to read there, and I hope you can read it on your iPad. But as Keith said, we've maintained about $10 million in operating revenues since 2008, when the original rate structure was put out there, or was approved or adopted. In 2012, you'll see there's a little more revenue there. That is investment income. We had a good year in investment returns that year. So that's the reason for a little bit more revenue you see there. Expenditures, again, I've grown them at 3%. If you go down to net income, you'll see, we do have operating income, but that's before we start spending money on capital outlay and pollution. So if you go to your net increase and decrease, you'll see some very, very large decreases in cash. We've budgeted to decrease cash about $5 million in 2018, 6.3 in 2019, 4.4 in 2020, and so on. And the 2024 year, that is the big year. Keith mentioned that we postponed some of the pollution remediation and that's a very large expense that's out in the future that regulatory, we have to make that happen. So the cash at the end of 2017 was almost $25 million. And with 3 rate increases of 8%, we will still be almost in a negative situation. We'll use all of our cash. And our fund balance policy says we'll maintain one-time expenditures, which would be about $10 million. So we're nowhere near meeting our fund balance policy. And just as a reminder, we do have bonds outstanding of about $10 million now, and we'll slowly pay those off over the next 6 years to be about 6.6. And one other financial indicator that you should be aware of is that when we issued our revenue bonds, there were several tests that we had to meet according to the trust agreement. And one of them says that, our second prong says that we will have 1 times coverage of operating income to debt service. That means you have enough left in operations to make your debt service payment. And you can see we budgeted just 1 time, 1.1 time in 2018. So that is just covering our debt. So we cannot go below that in the future. So with that news, take any questions?
Crystal clear.
I'm sorry. Okay. You had your hand up just a while ago.
Committee members first.
All right. Mr. Taylor? No?
I think that was a crystal clear presentation.
All right.
Ugly, but crystal clear.
Legally.
If there are no hands up, we'll move on.
Okay.
Yes. All right.
For Keith, the $831 per acre for the commercial, is that regardless of how much impervious is on it? Is that just a per acre, or is that?
Yeah,
It's not fractional if you've got
yeah,
own an
it's
acre and half
based
of it
on
is
if you have a tenth of an acre, you're charged at $831 times that 0.1 acre. So
okay,
you're
so it's not
charged.
actual coverage. It's by zone.
It's by coverage, but it's based on, you can have a fraction of an acre. So you could be charged a minimum $55 for that site because it only has, say, a 10 by 10 Leonard building on it, for example. You would be charged for that a minimum fee.
So if
Am
I'm
I answering
understanding
your
your question, it's the impervious, it's actual impervious
on
that acre percentage. Of
They
the,
actually measure the footprint of the property, GPS it in,
right.
and then that square footage is the rate that they would pay.
Okay. There are no exemptions from paying this. 501c3s, everybody pays, right? To talk about the situation down at City Yard, I'm sure all have investigated, but there's no brownfields money available to a municipality that might be available to a
not that we're aware of, that would qualify, that we would qualify for. And
right.
We'll keep on looking as we get closer to the date when the project needs to happen.
Maybe
we're not aware of anything now.
Maybe do a partnership with a private entity and let them get a brownfield.
It would have to be something like that.
Yeah. And then on the revenue projections, what are those based on? A rise in a certain percentage rise in?
They were just simply based on keeping the fund solvent. I just put in 8%. I just came up with a number to, we could do it many different ways. We could do
right.
it every other year. We could play with those numbers, but just out the gate, I said, let's just put 8% in, see where we end up.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Larson?
Can I follow up on the cost of the projections here as far as revenue generating? Can I assume then that the moving from 10 million, 10.7 to 11.5 represents the 8% increase? That's it?
That's it.
Do we plug in the development that's going on in this town regarding neighborhoods and houses and streets and stuff that we're putting in? Do we have a percentage factor as far as impermeable surfaces that are part of our development or the county or the city?
We have staff that go out, and as soon as those developments are ready to be built, we'll go out and physically GPS those properties in. We'll turn those projects into revenue, and that is our impervious tally that's increasing all the time.
Right, and so we have a history of that. Do we have an estimate of annual percentage increase that occurs from those kinds of developments in our budget development? The point is, it seems to be one recommendation we're getting is an 8% increase. in the fee structure. And the maps and the graphs seem to be based on those calculations, based on what we're currently spending and what I don't understand, or what I don't see, is the other factor, which seems to be the development that is occurring within the city and the county of services that are automatically then being added to the revenue generation stream, and where that fits into our calculations. Is that reflected somewhere that I'm not seeing it, or?
I'll try to take a stab at that. We're looking at the actual revenues. We're actually looking at the revenues that are coming in for residential and non-residential stormwater billing versus the square footage. Because your collection rates, Lisa, your residential rates are higher, mid-90s, commercial's a little bit lower, so those collection rates factor into it. So we look at the actual revenues for residents. In the projections, yeah, absolutely.
So that is in these projections that I'm looking at on this page already? Or am I looking at, the question is, am I looking only at the 8% rate increase, or am I looking at the projection for increased revenues that are coming from the development of impermeable
I think
surfaces?
for this projection, you are only looking at the 8% increase.
Right. So what I need to understand is when you show me where we hit our crisis point in the previous chart, which is 2023, if that is based on the 8% rate increase figures, that seems to be lacking a piece of information about what the real revenue stream is. Is that, am I understand?
I think I understand your question, and I'm not sure how to answer that piece of the growth. But what we can say historically, since 2008, they've not changed. It's been $10 million.
We've had no growth in
There's
our
been no
impermeable
growth.
services since '08 in this city.
As far as revenues,
I don't understand how that can happen. Are we losing impermeable surfaces that is washing out on an annual basis that we are not? I mean, obviously we've taken off the airport. We've taken off. Well, you gave us an example of $78,000, $80,000 of revenue that have dropped off last year, for example, in these two examples. But I think those are probably fairly exceptional examples. And what I was sort of asking was, do we have a record, sort of a track record? But you're telling me that since '08, we have seen no increase annually based on the generation of additional impermeable surfaces in this city.
yeah, and impermeable surface, we are constantly measuring impermeable surface.
Right.
But as far as the revenues, we haven't seen an increase. We are constantly measuring impervious surface.
Right.
But the offset from decommissioning to measured, yeah, we're with this projection, we are looking at the dollars, the actual revenue that we've collected from residential versus non-residential. But we do continue to measure impervious surface.
Let's get Mr. McIntosh in. You appear to have a point relevant to that,
Well,
or a
yeah.
question.
So there's an 8% revenue increase that's factored in here. Is that a rate increase, or is that a revenue increase?
Rate.
Or are they the same?
The rate increase. Yeah, what they've done is a rate
Yeah,
increase.
so rate.
Right.
They're not projecting, at this point, they're not projecting any growth from just,
Okay, so that understates
That's
revenue.
yeah, although based on collections and on decommissioning, they haven't seen a lot of, in previous years, a lot of real growth.
Yeah,
That's a very surprising. Yeah.
Well, one thing that's worth keeping in mind, I think, in regard to that, is that a lot of development we're seeing is where we're targeting redevelopment of already impervious surface. So that increases our property tax base, but it doesn't affect the stormwater fund revenue. And when we look at the rate structure, which we deliberately set to control, adverse impacts on smaller properties, a lot of the inside the city limits, a lot of the new development is deliberately smaller footprint and is going to be smaller actual increase in the revenue received. I mean, it's paying its fair share according to our estimates of where our costs are coming from, and they're paying the same as the existing customers, but it's not making a significant net change in our revenue received. So, Mr. McGovern, yes.
You made the point that I was going to make in terms of when we look at 2008 to now, we've seen a great amount of investment in development, but where has that happened?
And our policies are designed to encourage redevelopment and revitalization rather than sprawl. And
That's the flip side of that.
it's in terms of our net cost to taxpayers in delivering service. That's a plus because we get more in new revenue than we're from that redevelopment and revitalization than we're adding in expenses. But it also does have an adverse effect on this particular part of the revenue. Yes.
Yeah, I'd add too that our construction requirements as far as stormwater construction, which are major costs, give a lot of incentives to everybody, including the city, when we're building a fire station, to try to not increase that impervious surface area by too much, because then it can kick in multi-million-dollar requirements. So our policies do encourage retaining or reducing impervious surface.
But at the same time, our costs are going up in substantial part because we have old infrastructure that is aging out and has to be dealt with. So. Good conversation. Other questions? That gives me a clearer picture of what the actual numbers are, and we've had some good elaboration on why that's the case. I tell you what, I get more complaints about water bills than I do about property taxes.
Stormwater or
Water, but it's combined bill. And so I'm not particularly anxious on my part to do anything that's going to increase the charges that, beyond what we absolutely have to do to our residents on their water sewer bill. Yes.
One thing, as we continue to look at this, it doesn't necessarily have to be done. At some point, we will have to raise the rates, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done in June. It could be done January of next year, maybe a smaller increase, and then monitor it each year as we go forward. It's going to vary depending on what our capital needs are. That's, Mr. Huff said, that's what drives the cost, is these large projects like Spring Park, $1.5 million. That's what drives it.
Mr. Montgomery?
Is that a council action? Or is that a utility?
That's a council act.
So we get to be the bad guys, but we also get to determine the time frame on which we're the bad guys. Mr. Larson.
I think it's interesting to note, and I will say thank you for the work at Old Salem that you're doing. Huge infrastructure improvement, long overdue, and I understand the need to do these capital projects, and there's no question the city has got to invest in those things to make it. I think what's interesting about this, and so the public can know, that there's certain things that fall into your budget that you might not expect, and that's, for example, street sweeping. The money that you put in goes into street sweeping, keeps the leaves and debris out of the gutters, and then out of the streams and the water and everything else. And vector, I assume that's rat control, is part of this project. And these kinds of little things that people don't understand, but they all sort of relate to that. So it's a complicated pie chart if you actually look at what's in there, and what leaf collection. Part of it, a big chunk of the budget is with street cleaning and leaf collection. Those both fall within the stormwater runoff. So we're getting, it's more than just water quality, as it were, and those capital improvement projects. So thank you for what you do.
Although there is a direct water quality impact from street sweeping and leaf collection, because otherwise that's organic material and oils and heavy metals that are going in the water. So it's a legitimate connection. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mr. McIntosh?
So the options to pay for this, the multi-million dollars that we're going to need, is through raising rates, some bonding, right? Can we issue additional bonds? No?
Well,
Tapped out there?
no, we're not. But we would have to adopt a policy to have recurring rate increases, because the rates are the collateral for the debt. So if you don't adopt a policy to have recurring rate increases, you can't go to the bond market. They would not be highly rated bonds. So I'm not saying you can't. I think there's just there's a different decision-making that would have to happen to
Right.
issue debt.
To me, it's kind of like looking at a mortgage.
Mhm.
If we spread it out over time, then the impact is relatively less.
But you would have to have a $10 million reserve in your, I mean, there are many other financial
Yeah.
indicators you'd have to have.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
thanks.
I'm sorry to do this. Can you go back then to the next sheet and go down to that bottom line where it says bonds outstanding?
Yes,
So am I to understand that we are currently carrying $10 million worth of bond
You are.
debt on our water sewer?
correct. You issued
Right.
10 million, you issued 12 or 13 million, I can't remember now, I think it was 13 in 2013, in stormwater revenue bonds.
So we created that in the last bond referendum we paid?
No.
No,
And the revenue
No.
bonds.
revenue bonds.
Yes.
They're secured by the revenues of the utility.
And so, okay, and so that debt load, is that based on, then your .00, is that where we're
The
looking at?
debt service payments that are being
Right.
made, that's how that's calculated, yes.
And so our expenditure then includes paying out those bonds?
Correct.
Those costs and the...
Right. It's about 853 some thousand annually.
Carrying a lot of debt.
It's small in comparison.
Manageable.
Compared.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Good presentation. We appreciate it. And that completes our agenda this evening. Unless, Mr. Turner, is there anything else?
No?
Surely, there must be
think so.
something.
Thank you very much. In that case, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.